Well, welcome to the Fire Bible Study. It's VBS week at Evangel, and so we have turned every space on this campus into a special space for VBS, which means my studio has been turned into a media room for VBS. So I've been booted out of there. I had to find a place. I'm kind of like in a closet. As a matter of fact, here's what I challenge you to do. If you think you know where I'm at on the campus of Evangel, put it in the comments section. This will just be for 1 week. I know the lighting's not the best and the background's a little bit different, but we've got some teaching to share with you, and I'm glad that you're here. If you're not familiar with the Fire Bible Study, we're in the book of Genesis in a series we're calling In the Beginning God, because that's where it all started. And we're looking at the most interesting character in the book of Genesis, and it is Joseph. So we've seen him as the disliked brother and yet the favorite son of his father Jacob. And because he was disliked and because he was a bit of a braggart, he goes to the brothers and says, someday you're going to bow down to me. I'm going to be in charge. I'm going to be the top dog. They don't like that at all. They get this opportunity. They're going to kill him, but brother has a little bit of conscience, says, hey, why don't we just sell him? And they send him off, sold as a slave, out of the land of what we would call the Holy Land today, where Israel is located on the map today, into the land of Egypt. And that's where we find him. So we're going to pick up this story because he has been hired, if you would, as an indentured servant into the household of a guy by the name of Potiphar. Powerful military man. And Joseph does well, and he prospers. Joseph was a good-looking young man. And tonight we're going to see that he gets falsely accused. So, if you have your notes, jump in here with me. We're on Lesson 17. This is July 12th, as this is appearing. And again, it's VBS week. And so while I'm teaching you, we've got VBS going on all across the Evangel campus, and next week we'll be back in our regular studio. The lighting will be better. I'll be sitting behind the desk there, and we'll be kind of back to normal. But tonight, grab your notes and let's go. If you would like these notes, we can get them to you. If you're just scrolling past this for the very first time, we'd love to get them to you. Just contact Evangel Church in Montgomery. So let's jump right in. First bullet: when Joseph arrived in Egypt, the country was ruled by foreigners, the Hyksos, line of pharaohs. In general, they were disliked by the natives. So, I don't have time to go through all of that. I might, if I go into the book of Exodus and talk a little more in detail about what's going on. But in the land of Egypt, for a season, for a segment of their history, the dynasty was not led by Egyptians. It was foreigners that had come in and taken over, and they were the leaders of the country. And so the common Egyptian didn't care for them. That's important to understand both now and later after Joseph has died. It's very important. So these leaders were not Egyptians. Later, when the Hyksos pharaohs were driven violently from power, so the Egyptians rose up against them, foreigners such as Jacob's family, because we're going to see Jacob and his entire family are going to move to Israel. We're not to that yet, but that's going to happen. People like Jacob's family, which is all of the Jews, all of the Israelites, were dealt with harshly, as is seen in the book of Exodus. That's when they're put literally into slavery. But at this point in the land, as Joseph has been brought there, past the pyramids, which were already in place, and the Sphinx, to ancient Memphis, which was then the capital of Egypt. These Hyksos are in control. Pick up a story. Now, when Joseph arrived in Egypt with the Ishmaelite traders, those were the ones that had bought Joseph from his brothers, he was purchased by Potiphar, a member of the personal staff of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was the captain of the palace guard. The Lord was with Joseph, you might underline that, and blessed him greatly as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything that he did. So Potiphar recognized that. So Joseph naturally became quite a favorite with him. Potiphar soon put Joseph in charge of his entire household and entrusted him with all of his business dealings. From the day Joseph was put in charge, the Lord began to bless Potiphar for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs began to run smoothly, and his crops and livestock, they flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything that he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't have to worry. And he didn't have a worry in the world, except to decide what he wanted to eat. Now, Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. One of the things that I love about Joseph is that no matter what circumstance or situation, because we're going to see him in a very precarious situation in tonight's study, whatever situation you find him in, he works faithfully and diligently as unto the Lord. He applies himself, and that's exactly what he did here. He's been sold into slavery. He could have been bitter and slouching around and just not caring, giving up on life. But that wasn't Joseph. So he applied himself, and he was productive. And that made things begin to happen, and Potiphar began to notice that. Now, enter the cougar. What are you saying, Pastor? Well, in today's vernacular, cougar is an older woman who pursues a younger man. That's exactly what takes place. So we pick up the story. And about this time, Potiphar's wife began to desire him, speaking of Joseph, and invited him to sleep with her. She's not pulling any punches. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in the entire household. No one has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I ever do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. She kept putting pressure on him day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he was doing his work inside the house. She came and grabbed him by his shirt, demanding, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but as he did, his shirt came off. She was left holding it as he ran from the house. When she saw that she had his shirt and that he had fled, she began screaming. Soon all the men round the palace came running. My husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to insult us, she sobbed. He tried to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard my loud cries, he ran and left his shirt behind with me. She kept the shirt with her. And when her husband came home that night, she told him her story. That Hebrew slave that you had around here tried to make a fool of me, she said. I was saved only by my screams. He ran out, leaving his shirt behind. After hearing his wife's story, Potiphar was furious. He took Joseph, threw him in the prison where the king's prisoners were held. Wow. You talk about a bad series of events. Joseph's been sold into slavery by his own brothers. He works faithfully and diligently. He's prospered. He rises up in the ranks, if you would, in Potiphar's household, and now Potiphar's wife falsely accuses. You might wonder why Potiphar didn't have him executed immediately, and we don't know. The scripture doesn't really tell us. My hunch is simply this. I personally think he didn't believe her story. I don't think this was the first time she'd had some infidelity issues. I don't think he believed her. But for her sake and for his sake, he had to do something, so he put him in prison. I put it in your notes here. It's a prison that is notorious. It's a terrible prison. Historians know it as the prison of Tar at Saru, Egypt. It was located at the border between Egypt and Palestine. Matter of fact, it wasn't far from Hebron, where he was originally from. He's right there on the border. And Joseph's life is now there in prison. But once again, note what Joseph does. He took Joseph and he threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, but the Lord was with Joseph there too. You might underline that. And he granted Joseph favor with the chief jailer. Before long, the jailer put Joseph in charge of all other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The chief jailer had no more worries after that because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him, making everything run smoothly and successfully. Everything he touches has the Midas touch on him. It's absolutely incredible. Now again, Joseph could have yielded to temptation. We're told in sermons often that she was beautiful. We don't know that. Could have been. But Joseph refused to enter into that kind of illicit relationship with her for two reasons. I want you to note these in your notes. Fill this in. It would have been an injustice to Potiphar, who had treated him very kindly, had treated him decently. He wasn't going to do that to this man that had watched over him. And secondly, he would have been an affront to his holy God. That action would have been an affront to his holy God. So Joseph's in prison. Now, he's in his teens. God had come to Joseph and given him this dream that indicated he was going to be a great leader, that there was greatness. But suddenly, he's despised by his brothers. He's sold into slavery. He finds himself in Pharaoh's military prison here when Potiphar's wife had attempted and falsely accused him of sexual infidelity. And yet God was with Joseph. King David wrote it this way: "Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into the heavens, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwelt in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee." David was simply saying, look, wherever you're at, do what's right. And that's what Joseph did. Why did God allow Joseph to be so mistreated? Why was he not miraculously delivered from that evil prison and from those brothers? Why? Because, write this in your note, God is sovereign. That word, sovereign or sovereignty, is the bottom line of all solid theology. It means that God can do anything he chooses with anyone he wants, anywhere, under any circumstances, that is within the keeping of his divine nature and results, write this down, in his will being carried out on earth as in heaven. That's sovereignty. Now, I could take an entire month of Wednesday studies to just deal with sovereignty. But let me explain kind of the big picture, and I put it in this next paragraph. God knew that famine was coming to this part of the earth and that multitudes were going to die of salvation unless there was a man of great wisdom. And some of those that would die would certainly be his chosen people. The very lineage from where Jesus, the Messiah, one day would come from Abraham's seed. See, God sovereignly knew that. So he had to raise someone up like that. Well, he sees Joseph God does. But he's still a teenage boy with all the inefficiencies and the deficiencies that teenagers have. And he had to school him. And I put it in the last part of this paragraph, by the University of Hard Knocks. It was a 12-year program that Joseph was a part of to prepare him to become the leader that would bring the world and that part of the world through this famine, but that would ultimately save his own family, his own people, his own nation, that nation that would one day produce Jesus, your Lord, my Lord, our Savior and King. Notice the next bullet. But when Joseph graduated from this school of hard knocks, he came forth magna cum laude with a degree in divine service. Write that in your notes. That's a degree that you need and a degree that I need. Now, he was ready to serve after going through these things. What did Joseph have to learn? Let's look at this quickly, because I think it's some things that you and I need to learn. First of all, Joseph had to learn that he could not govern a nation until he could govern himself. That's true in your life and my life. We can't govern others. We can't be leaders. We can't have authority. We can't be used by God until we can govern ourselves. One cannot preach to multitudes until he or she faithfully ministers to a few. One does not receive much from God until he or she has shown good stewardship over, write this in your notes, little. Joseph had to learn to trust God implicitly. Joseph never forgot the two dreams of his teenage years, and he believed that even now God would use him in a glorious way. That might be you. God's given you some kind of dream, some kind of vision, some kind of sense of purpose and destiny, and right now you seem to be in a difficult and floundering time. You might, my friend, be in the school of hard knocks. You know, I've spent many years there and go back for continuing education quite frequently. We all do as followers of Christ. That evil prison was, write this in your notes, the classroom in which Joseph would master the course for which God had intended for him all along. Chapter 40. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and the baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against the two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in the ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in his ward. So, write this in your notes. Joseph had to learn to master his heart and mind before he could ever master Egypt and the world. Paul said it this way in Philippians. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, then think on these things. Now Joseph is confronted by two men in worse condition than he is. For while Potiphar was angry at Joseph, Pharaoh, write this in your notes, Pharaoh was ready to execute both of these men. So here's a lesson. There's always someone worse off than you. Whatever you might be going through, whatever you might be struggling with right now, you can just kind of count on it. The two men were Pharaoh's butler and baker. What had they done? We don't know. We can only kind of speculate, if you would. I think it was a botched attempt to assassinate the Pharaoh. It was something the baker had made that got past the butler, who was responsible to check the food before Pharaoh consumed it. Remember, the common Egyptians hated those pharaohs that were over them. Makes sense. That's probably what happened, and that's what I put in your notes. Remember, the Pharaoh during this period of Egyptian history were not Egyptians and were hated. But whether it was this offense or not, it was going to mean death. Now these two condemned men meet Joseph, who no matter what he seemed to be, he would come out on top. A man's gift maketh room for him, and bringeth him before great men. That was the gift that Joseph had. Years earlier, Joseph had had two dreams that would shape his life. You remember those dreams? And he would rise in this great place of leadership. Now, he learns of two more dreams that will ultimately change his life forever. They are the dreams of the butler and the baker. Because of time, I'm going to let you read, but I'd encourage you to read verses 5 through 19 of Genesis chapter 40 as he has this dream and outlines the difference between the butler and the baker. Let's summarize it here at the end of the passage. Joseph's words came true. The butler was restored to Pharaoh, but the baker was hanged. That's exactly what Joseph dreamed and declared. Because the butler, he has this dream, and it's a good dream, and the butler is excited about it. The baker says, well, hey, have a dream for me. And that dream wasn't so good. Read it for yourself. With the butler restored, Joseph hopes now have some life. He says, don't forget me. Perhaps now I've got an inroad because I was unjustly accused. But the butler forgets it. So some time goes by. Matter of fact, I believe it's 2 years. We pick up the story. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he gave a banquet for all of his officials and household staff. He sent for the chief cupbearer and chief baker, and they were brought to him from the prison. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, but he sentenced the chief baker to be impaled on a pole, just as Joseph had predicted. Pharaoh's cupbearer, however, promptly forgot all about Joseph. That had to be depressing. We're going to find out that it was 2 years. 2 more years in prison. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. It's not always on our timing, but next week we're going to see the miraculous hand of the Lord and his perfect timing. So let me just encourage you, if you're going through that difficult time, continue to serve the Lord faithfully. Continue to hold on to the dreams and the promises that God has, because like Joseph, which we'll see next week, God's got a hope and a future for your life. Until then, and we'll be back in our regular screening room. Pastor Mike, we'll see you next week.